The towering spires of the alien capital pierced the thick, golden haze of the planet's atmosphere. The human diplomat, clad in a formal suit tailored for interstellar meetings, stepped cautiously out of his ship. His boots touched the polished, obsidian-like surface of the alien landing platform. Around him, soldiers in ceremonial armor stood still as statues, their faces hidden behind reflective visors. He could feel their stares even though they said nothing. The diplomat had been briefed on this mission for months. The alien empire, known for its ruthless wars and rigid traditions, was humanity's most recent enemy. The ceasefire between their species had been shaky at best, but this meeting was supposed to change everything. The hope of peace rested on his shoulders, and he carried it heavily. As he approached the grand hall of the imperial palace, he felt a slight chill despite the humid air. The massive doors opened with a low rumble, revealing a cavernous chamber lined with towering statues of past rulers. At the far end, the alien emperor sat on an elevated throne, flanked by royal advisors and guards. Beside the throne stood a figure who drew every eye in the room: the emperor's daughter, the princess. She stood tall, her presence commanding yet strangely graceful. Her shimmering, silken attire reflected the soft light of the chamber, and her piercing violet eyes seemed to assess the human with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet intelligence in the way she observed everything, as if nothing escaped her notice. The diplomat was aware of her reputation, known not only for her beauty, but also for her sharp mind and ability to navigate the intricate web of imperial politics. He took a deep breath and approached the throne, bowing low in the human custom. "Your Majesty, I bring greetings and goodwill from Earth," he began, his voice steady but cautious. The emperor regarded him with cold eyes, his silence stretching uncomfortably. Finally, the emperor spoke, his voice deep and resonant. "Human," he said, the word heavy with disdain. "You come seeking peace, yet your kind has spilled our blood. Why should we trust you?" The diplomat had prepared for this. He responded calmly, choosing his words carefully. "Because war benefits neither of us. We stand at the edge of mutual destruction, but together we can build a future that will last generations. I am here to prove that humanity seeks not to dominate but to understand and coexist." The chamber grew silent. For a moment, the diplomat feared he had said the wrong thing. Then, to his surprise, the princess spoke. Her voice was melodic yet firm, carrying an air of authority that demanded attention. "You speak of coexistence," she said, her violet eyes locking onto his, "but words are easy to craft. How do we know they are not lies, like so many others before you?" The diplomat hesitated, feeling the weight of her question. He glanced around the room, aware that every eye was on him. "Trust cannot be demanded," he replied. "It must be earned. I ask only for the chance to prove myself, not just to you, but to all those who doubt humanity's intentions." The princess tilted her head slightly, as if intrigued by his response. The emperor waved a hand dismissively. "You will have your chance," he said, though his tone was far from welcoming. "For now, you will remain under the watch of my court. We will see if your actions match your words." The diplomat bowed again, his mind racing. He had expected hostility, but the emperor's grudging acceptance was more than he had hoped for. As he was escorted out of the chamber by a group of guards, he felt the princess's gaze linger on him. It was a brief moment, but something about it unsettled him. Was it suspicion, or was it something else entirely? Later that evening, the diplomat found himself in the guest quarters of the palace, a luxurious but heavily guarded space that felt more like a gilded cage. He sat by the window, staring out at the alien city. The spires sparkled against the dimming sky, and the streets below bustled with life. He wondered how many of these people saw him as a threat, an invader in their world. As he contemplated his next move, there was a soft knock on the door. Startled, he turned to see a palace attendant, a young alien woman, entering with a tray of food. She placed it on the table without a word, but before she left, she hesitated. "The princess was watching you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The diplomat blinked. "What do you mean?" "She watches everyone," the attendant said, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. "But with you, it was different. Be careful, human. Eyes are everywhere in this palace." Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He couldn't help but feel a growing unease. The princess's curiosity was dangerous, especially in a court where trust was a rare commodity. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her gaze than mere scrutiny. For now, though, he focused on his mission. Peace was his goal, but survival might come first. The diplomat awoke the next morning to the low hum of the alien city resonating through his chamber walls. The artificial light filtering through the tall, crystalline windows bathed the room in an ethereal glow. He stretched his stiff muscles and reminded himself that he was far from home, in the heart of what could easily be enemy territory. Moments later, a sharp knock interrupted his thoughts. The door slid open to reveal two guards standing stiffly, their metallic armor gleaming in the light. "The Emperor summons you," one of them announced, his voice devoid of emotion. The diplomat nodded, quickly straightening his attire. He followed the guards through the labyrinthine corridors of the palace, each one adorned with intricate carvings that seemed to tell stories of alien conquests and triumphs. As they walked, he noticed how the palace staff, attendants, officials, and even soldiers would pause to stare at him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disdain. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the task at hand. When they reached the grand hall, it was not the emperor who greeted him but the princess. She stood in the center of the chamber, her violet eyes fixed on him with the same intensity as the day before. The guards bowed and stepped back, leaving the two of them alone under the watchful gaze of the towering statues that lined the room. "You're early," she said, her tone carrying a hint of amusement. "I was told the emperor summoned me," the diplomat replied, carefully masking his confusion. "My father is preoccupied," she said, brushing a strand of her silvery hair behind her ear. "But I have questions of my own." The diplomat hesitated. He had not prepared for an encounter with the princess without the emperor's presence. Still, he knew he couldn't afford to offend her. "I'll answer as best as I can," he said. She began to circle him slowly, her gaze sharp and unrelenting. "Your people have a history of violence," she said. "You expand, you conquer, and you leave destruction in your wake. And yet, here you are, speaking of peace. Why?" The diplomat met her gaze, refusing to flinch under her scrutiny. "Because we've learned from our mistakes," he said. "War has cost us more than we care to admit. We want to grow, yes, but not at the expense of others. Peace benefits us all." The princess stopped in front of him, her expression unreadable. "And what if we don't believe you?" she asked softly. "What if we see your presence here as nothing more than a clever ruse?" He took a deep breath. "Then I'll do whatever it takes to prove otherwise," he said. "Words mean little without action. Give me the chance to show you that humanity can be trusted." For a moment, she said nothing, her piercing eyes studying him as if searching for cracks in his resolve. Then, to his surprise, a faint smile curved her lips. "You're bold for someone so vulnerable," she said. "It's intriguing." Before he could respond, the doors to the chamber swung open, and the emperor entered, flanked by his advisors. The princess stepped back, her expression instantly becoming neutral. The diplomat couldn't help but notice how quickly she masked her emotions, as if the brief moment of levity between them had never happened. The emperor's gaze flicked between his daughter and the human before settling on the latter. "You will accompany my daughter on a tour of our city," he announced without preamble. The diplomat blinked, caught off guard. "A tour?" The emperor's tone grew sharper. "If you are to understand our people, you must see them as they are, not as they are described in your reports. My daughter will ensure you learn properly." The diplomat bowed slightly. Of course, Your Majesty. I would be honored. The emperor nodded, his expression hard. Do not dishonor this gesture, human. My patience is thin. With that, he turned and left, his advisors trailing behind him. As the doors closed, the princess turned to the diplomat, her smile returning, this time with a mischievous edge. It seems you'll be spending more time with me than you anticipated, she said. He forced a polite smile. It seems so. A short while later, they were walking through the bustling streets of the alien capital. The princess led the way, her presence commanding respect from everyone they passed. The diplomat struggled to keep up, his senses overwhelmed by the sights and sounds around him. Towering buildings of shimmering glass-like material loomed overhead, while hovering transports zipped through the air. The streets were alive with alien vendors selling strange wares, their voices rising in a cacophony of languages. The princess finally stopped at a large plaza, where a towering obelisk stood at its center. Its surface was etched with what looked like ancient text, glowing faintly in the dim light. This is the heart of the empire, she said, gesturing to the obelisk. It tells the story of our rise, our victories, our sacrifices, and our unity. The diplomat stepped closer, marveling at the intricate carvings. It's beautiful, he said sincerely. The princess glanced at him, her expression softening. Our people take great pride in our history, she said. Perhaps one day, if your words prove true, we might share it with yours. The diplomat turned to her, sensing a subtle shift in her demeanor. And what do you think? He asked. About peace between our people. She hesitated, her gaze fixed on the obelisk. I think it's a fragile thing, she said. Easily broken, easily lost. But sometimes, the most fragile things are worth protecting. The diplomat nodded, understanding the weight of her words. For the first time since his arrival, he felt a glimmer of hope, not just for the mission, but for something far greater. The diplomat followed the princess through a narrow side street that led away from the Grand Plaza. The main avenues had been loud and overwhelming, but here, the air felt quieter, almost tranquil. The hum of alien activity softened into a distant murmur, and the tall buildings gave way to smaller, more modest structures. Where are we going now? The diplomat asked, his voice steady but curious. The princess glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. To where your reports won't take you, she said cryptically. He frowned but said nothing, trusting her to lead the way. It wasn't long before they arrived at a small, bustling marketplace nestled between the alleys. Unlike the polished grandeur of the main city, this place felt raw and alive, with aliens of all shapes and sizes haggling over strange goods. This, the princess said, gesturing to the crowd, is where you'll find the true heart of my people. Not in the towers or the grand halls, but here. The diplomat observed the scene closely. Vendors shouted over one another, trying to sell everything from glowing orbs to strange, wriggling creatures in small cages. The air was thick with unfamiliar smells, some sweet, others pungent and sharp. He noticed the way people moved, the way they interacted. There was a sense of community here, of life in its purest form. It's chaotic, he said after a moment. The princess raised an eyebrow. And yet there's order in the chaos. You just have to know where to look. As they walked through the market, the diplomat couldn't help but notice how the crowd parted for the princess. Some bowed their heads in respect, while others whispered among themselves. It was clear that she held great authority, even here. Do they fear you? He asked, keeping his voice low. Not fear, she said, her tone thoughtful. Respect, and perhaps a little distrust. They don't know what to make of my interest in you. The diplomat couldn't hide his surprise. Your interest in me? She stopped walking and turned to face him, her violet eyes locking onto his. You're a human, a species they've been taught to see as a threat. And yet, here you are, walking among them. That alone is enough to stir suspicion. He nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "It's not so different from how some humans would see you," he said. "Fear is a powerful thing, but it can be overcome." The princess studied him for a moment before turning away. "Perhaps," she said quietly. As they continued through the market, a sudden commotion drew their attention. A group of alien children had gathered around a merchant's stall, their laughter echoing through the air. The diplomat noticed the way their eyes lit up with excitement as they pointed at something on the vendor's table. Curious, he approached the stall, the princess following close behind. The merchant, a stout alien with multiple arms, was displaying a collection of small, glowing stones, each one pulsed with a soft, rhythmic light, casting a warm glow on the children's eager faces. "What are these?" the diplomat asked, leaning in for a closer look. "Luma stones," the merchant said gruffly. "They absorb the energy of the sun and release it in darkness, useful for those who can't afford artificial lighting." The diplomat reached out to touch one, but the merchant's hand shot out, stopping him. "Careful," the alien warned. "They're fragile." He nodded, withdrawing his hand. The princess watched the exchange with mild amusement. "You're like a child, fascinated by the simplest things," she said. He chuckled. "It's called curiosity. You should try it sometime." Her expression softened, and for a brief moment, she almost smiled. But before she could respond, a loud crash interrupted them. The diplomat turned to see a large, muscular alien shoving his way through the market, overturning stalls and scattering goods as he went. The merchant shouted in protest, but the aggressor ignored him, his focus locked on the princess. "Princess," the alien bellowed, his voice a deep growl. "What are you doing here among the commoners?" The crowd fell silent, their eyes darting between the princess and the newcomer. The diplomat tensed, instinctively stepping closer to her. "I go where I please," the princess said coolly, her voice steady. The alien sneered. "Your place is in the palace, not in the filth of the streets. Your father would not approve of this fraternizing." The diplomat's jaw tightened, but he held his tongue, sensing the tension in the air. "And yet here I am," the princess said, her gaze unwavering. "If you have a problem with that, take it up with my father." The alien hesitated, his bravado faltering under her steady glare. But before he could respond, the diplomat stepped forward. "Perhaps you should leave," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the silence. The alien turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "And who are you to speak to me, human?" "I'm her guest," the diplomat said, standing his ground. "And unless you want to explain to your emperor why you disrupted his daughter's business, I suggest you step aside." For a moment, the alien seemed ready to retaliate, but the princess raised a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "That's enough," she said sharply. "Leave us." The alien hesitated before finally backing away, muttering under his breath as he disappeared into the crowd. The diplomat let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Well," he said, turning to the princess, "that was eventful." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You're bold," she said. "That's dangerous here." "Sometimes boldness is necessary," he replied. The princess studied him for a moment before nodding. "Perhaps you're right," she said, "but be careful, diplomat. Not everyone will be so easily swayed." The sun began to dip low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the city. The marketplace had settled back into its usual rhythm after the confrontation, but the tension lingered in the diplomat's chest. He and the princess left the bustling market, walking silently down a quieter path lined with alien flora. The plants glowed faintly in the dim light, their bioluminescence creating an otherworldly atmosphere. The princess finally broke the silence. "You didn't have to intervene back there." "I couldn't just stand by," the diplomat replied. "He was disrespecting you." She glanced at him, her violet eyes reflecting the fading sunlight. "I could have handled him myself." "I don't doubt that," he said with a small smile. "But I wasn't going to let him intimidate you, or me." The corner of her mouth twitched as if she wanted to smile but was holding herself back. "You're different from the humans I've read about," she said after a moment. "They're always described as calculating, strategic. You seem more impulsive." "Impulsive," he repeated with a chuckle. "I prefer instinctive." The princess didn't respond, but he noticed the faintest hint of amusement in her expression. They walked in silence for a while longer, the city growing quieter as they moved away from the busy districts. Eventually, they reached a secluded garden tucked between two towering buildings. The air here was cooler, filled with the scent of alien blossoms that shimmered softly in the dusk. The princess led him to a stone bench beneath a tree with glowing golden leaves. "This is one of the few places in the city where I can think," she said, sitting down gracefully. The diplomat took a seat beside her, careful to keep a respectful distance. "It's beautiful," he said, looking around. "Peaceful." She nodded. "It's where I come when the palace feels too suffocating." He studied her for a moment, noticing the way her shoulders relaxed as she gazed at the garden. "It must be hard," he said gently, "being surrounded by so many expectations." Her eyes flicked to him, sharp and searching. "Why do you care?" He hesitated, caught off guard by her directness. "Because I've been in situations where everyone expected me to be something I wasn't," he said finally. "It's exhausting. I wouldn't wish that on anyone." The princess regarded him quietly, her expression softening. "You speak as though you understand," she said. "Maybe I do," he replied. "In my line of work, there's always pressure to perform, to succeed. But at least I have the option to walk away. You don't." She looked away, her gaze drifting to the golden leaves above them. "No, I don't," she said softly. The moment hung between them, heavy with unspoken truths. The diplomat wanted to say more, to offer some kind of reassurance, but he wasn't sure what would be appropriate. Instead, he let the silence speak for them. After a while, the princess stood, her movements fluid and deliberate. "Come," she said, "there's something else I want to show you." Curious, he followed her as she led him through the garden and into a hidden passageway. The path wound downward, the air growing cooler and the light dimmer. Finally, they emerged into a vast underground chamber. The diplomat stopped in his tracks, his eyes widening in awe. The chamber was filled with towering crystals that pulsed with a soft inner light. The walls shimmered like liquid metal, reflecting the glow of the crystals in a mesmerizing display. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's called the Chamber of Echoes," the princess said, her voice reverent. "It's one of the oldest places in our city, built long before the palace or the markets. Few know of its existence." He stepped closer to one of the crystals, marveling at its otherworldly beauty. "Why did you bring me here?" "Because I wanted you to see something real," she said. "Something untouched by politics or war." The diplomat turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "You trust me enough to share this." The princess met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "I don't know why," she admitted, "but yes, I do." Before he could respond, a faint humming sound filled the chamber. He looked around, trying to locate the source, but the princess seemed unfazed. "The crystals respond to energy," she explained. "Your presence has awakened them." He watched in amazement as the crystal's light grew brighter, their hum deepening into a harmonious melody. It was as if the chamber itself was alive, reacting to their very existence. "It's incredible," he said, his voice filled with wonder. The princess nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "This is what we're fighting to protect," she said. "Not just our people, but places like this, our history, our legacy." He looked at her, seeing her in a new light. "I understand," he said quietly. For a moment, they simply stood there, surrounded by the glowing crystals and the haunting melody. It was a rare, fleeting moment of connection, untainted by the complexities of their worlds. But the moment was broken by a sudden, sharp sound, a metallic clang that echoed through the chamber. The diplomat instinctively stepped closer to the princess, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Someone's here," he said, his voice tense. The princess's expression hardened. "We need to leave. Now." Without another word, she led him back toward the passageway, her movements swift and purposeful. The humming of the crystals faded behind them, replaced by the ominous sound of footsteps approaching from the darkness. The diplomat's heart pounded in his chest as they hurried through the winding path, the weight of their discovery and the threat of pursuit pressing heavily on his mind. Whatever had just happened, he knew their fragile connection and their precarious situation had just become even more complicated. The faint sound of footsteps echoed through the narrow passage as the princess led the diplomat out of the chamber of echoes. Her pace was quick, her movements sharp and calculated. The diplomat could sense her unease, though she did well to hide it. He followed close behind, his heart pounding with adrenaline. "Who could it be?" he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "Someone who shouldn't be here," the princess replied curtly, her voice low but firm. "This chamber is a secret, known only to a few. If they found it, they're looking for something, or someone." The diplomat didn't need to ask who she meant. It was obvious the target could very well be her. The narrow passage opened into the garden once more, the glowing trees and flowers casting faint, eerie light on their surroundings. The princess stopped suddenly and pressed a hand against the trunk of one of the trees. To the diplomat's surprise, a hidden panel slid open, revealing a small metallic console embedded in the tree. "What are you doing?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "Securing the chamber," she said. Her fingers danced over the console, inputting commands in a language he couldn't read. Moments later, a soft rumble echoed from behind them. "The entrance is sealed," she said, straightening. "No one else will get in." "That's a neat trick," he said, impressed despite the tension in the air. She shot him a brief glance, her expression unreadable. "Come on. We can't stay here." They moved quickly through the garden, heading toward the main paths of the city. The streets were quieter now, the bustle of the day replaced by the gentle hum of streetlights and the occasional murmur of passing citizens. Still, the diplomat couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As they turned a corner, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. A figure cloaked in shadows darted into an alleyway, disappearing before he could get a good look. "Someone's following us," he said, his voice tight. The princess didn't slow down. "I know," she said calmly. "Stay close to me." He obeyed, his senses on high alert. They passed through a series of winding streets, the city's labyrinthine layout, both a blessing and a curse. It made it harder for their pursuer to track them, but it also made it easier for the diplomat to lose his bearings. "Where are we going?" he asked after a while. "To a safe house," the princess replied. "It's not far." The diplomat didn't question her. He trusted her instincts, even if the situation felt increasingly dire. They reached the edge of the residential district, where the buildings grew smaller and more spaced out. The princess led him to a modest-looking structure tucked away behind a cluster of glowing trees. She pressed her hand to a biometric scanner beside the door, and it slid open with a soft hiss. "Inside," she said, gesturing for him to enter. The diplomat stepped into the safe house, his eyes quickly scanning the interior. The space was small but functional, with minimal furnishings and a faint hum of hidden technology. The princess entered behind him, locking the door and activating what he assumed was some sort of security system. "We'll be safe here for now," she said, her tone brisk. The diplomat nodded, though he couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of unease. "Who do you think it was back there? In the chamber?" She hesitated, her gaze distant. "I have a few suspicions," she admitted, "but I don't want to jump to conclusions." "You think it's someone from the palace," he guessed. Her silence was answer enough. The diplomat sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This just keeps getting more complicated, doesn't it?" "It was never going to be simple," she said, sitting down on a low bench. For the first time that evening, she looked weary, the weight of her responsibilities etched into her features. He sat across from her, leaning forward slightly. "You don't have to face this alone, you know," he said. "I'm here to help." She looked at him, her expression softening ever so slightly. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care so much? You barely know me." "Because I believe in doing what's right," he said simply. "And because I see someone who's trying to protect her people, even when it puts her at risk." For a moment, she didn't respond. Then, to his surprise, she let out a quiet laugh, a sound that was equal parts amusement and disbelief. "You really are impulsive, aren't you?" "Instinctive," he corrected with a grin. Before she could respond, a faint beeping sound filled the room. The princess stood immediately, her posture tense. She moved to a console embedded in the wall, her fingers flying over the controls. "What is it?" the diplomat asked, rising to his feet. "An alert," she said grimly. "Someone's breached the perimeter." The diplomat felt his stomach drop. "Here." She nodded, her expression dark. "They must have followed us." "Do you have weapons here?" he asked, his tone urgent. The princess pressed a hidden panel on the wall, revealing a small cache of alien weaponry. She handed him a sleek, silver device that hummed faintly in his hand. "Do you know how to use it?" she asked. "I'll figure it out," he said, gripping the weapon tightly. She armed herself as well, her movements swift and precise. "Stay close to me," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. The sound of footsteps grew louder outside, accompanied by the faint hum of approaching drones. The diplomat's pulse quickened as he and the princess positioned themselves near the door, ready for whatever, or whoever, came next. The soft hum of the alien security system filled the tense silence inside the safe house. Outside, faint footsteps and the occasional buzz of drones grew louder. The diplomat's grip on the alien weapon tightened. It was lighter than he'd expected, almost delicate in his hands, but he could feel its power humming through the strange material. The princess moved with quiet precision, positioning herself near the door. Her eyes were sharp, her breathing steady. There was no trace of fear on her face, only determination. "Are you sure about this?" the diplomat whispered, glancing at her. "We have no choice," she replied. "They've come too far. If we don't fight now, they'll capture us." "Capture you," he corrected. "I'm just collateral damage." Her gaze softened for a moment, but her voice remained firm. "Not to me. You're here because you chose to help me, and I won't let them harm you." Before he could respond, the door shook violently. A loud metallic clang echoed through the room, followed by a robotic voice speaking in the alien language. The diplomat didn't need to understand the words to know it was a warning. "They're trying to override the security," the princess said, her tone calm but urgent. "They won't stop until they get in." "How long can the system hold?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not long enough." The door rattled again, harder this time, and the metallic voice grew louder. The diplomat took a deep breath, his mind racing. He wasn't a soldier, but he'd been in enough high-pressure situations to know that panicking wouldn't help. "Do you have an escape plan?" he asked. "There's a secondary exit," she said, motioning toward a hidden panel on the far wall. "But they'll expect us to run. We need to distract them first." He nodded, glancing around the room for anything that could give them an advantage. His eyes landed on a small glowing device tucked into the weapon cache. "What about that?" he asked, pointing. The princess followed his gaze and immediately understood. "A decoy beacon," she said, grabbing it. "It emits a heat signature similar to mine. If we activate it, it might draw them away." "Do it," he said. "I'll cover you." She didn't hesitate. With swift, practiced movements, she activated the beacon and tossed it toward the far corner of the room. The device blinked to life, emitting a faint, pulsing glow. The princess turned back to him, her expression serious. "When the door opens, they'll go for the beacon. We'll have a few seconds to slip out the back. Stay close to me, no matter what." The diplomat nodded, his pulse quickening as the door shook again. This time, the sound was followed by a sharp hiss of escaping air, a sign that the seals were failing. "Here we go," she murmured, raising her weapon. The door burst open with a deafening crash, and 3 figures rushed inside, their forms obscured by dark cloaks. They moved quickly, their weapons scanning the room for targets. The beacon worked as intended. The intruders zeroed in on the glowing device, their attention momentarily diverted. "Now," the princess hissed, grabbing the diplomat's arm and pulling him toward the hidden panel. The diplomat followed her lead, his heart pounding as they slipped through the narrow opening. The passage beyond was dimly lit and barely wide enough for them to move side by side. The princess sealed the panel behind them, plunging the passage into near total darkness. "They'll figure out the decoy soon," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to move quickly." He nodded, his breaths coming fast and shallow. The passage sloped downward, leading them deeper beneath the city. The air grew cooler, the faint hum of machinery echoing around them. "Where does this lead?" he asked, his voice hushed. "To the old maintenance tunnels," she replied. "They've been out of use for decades, but they're still connected to the outer districts. If we can reach the end, we'll be outside their search perimeter. And if we can't?" She glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips despite the tension. "Then we improvise." They pressed on, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the soft, metallic flooring. The diplomat couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, but he forced himself to focus on the path ahead. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened into a larger chamber. The walls were lined with ancient, rusted machinery, and faint beams of light filtered in through cracks in the ceiling. "This way," the princess said, leading him toward a metal ladder bolted to the far wall. She climbed first, her movements swift and graceful. The diplomat followed, his hands slipping slightly on the cold, damp rungs. When they reached the top, she pushed open a heavy grate, revealing the open sky above. The city's outskirts stretched out before them, the glowing lights of the central districts fading into the distance. They were on the edge of a dense forest, the tall, alien trees swaying gently in the night breeze. "We're almost there," she said, helping him out of the tunnel. But their relief was short-lived. As they stepped onto the forest floor, a low, mechanical hum filled the air. The diplomat turned, his stomach sinking as he saw a drone hovering just above the tree line. "They found us," he said, his voice tight. The princess raised her weapon, her jaw set. "Not yet. They haven't." With a single precise shot, she took out the drone, the explosion lighting up the dark forest for a brief moment. "Let's go," she said, grabbing his hand and pulling him deeper into the trees. As they ran, the diplomat couldn't help but admire her resolve. Despite the danger, she never faltered, never hesitated. And for the first time, he realized just how far he was willing to go to help her, no matter the cost. The dense forest seemed to stretch endlessly around them, shadows shifting as the faint glow of distant searchlights danced on the horizon. The diplomat's lungs burned, and his legs felt heavy, but he pushed on, following the princess as she navigated the alien terrain with ease. Her hand gripped his tightly, as if letting go might mean losing him forever. "They're gaining on us," he said between labored breaths, glancing over his shoulder. The faint hum of drones was growing louder, accompanied by the sharp cries of the pursuers. The princess didn't slow down. "We're close, just a little farther." "How can you be so sure?" he asked, struggling to keep up. "Because I know this place," she replied. "It's where my people used to hide during the old wars. There's a safe zone ahead. If we reach it, they won't dare follow." The diplomat wanted to believe her, but doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. The drones were faster than they were, and the pursuers were relentless. He could hear the occasional crack of branches snapping underfoot and the distant thrum of alien engines. They were running out of time. Suddenly, the princess came to an abrupt stop, pulling him down behind a massive moss-covered tree. She pressed a finger to her lips, signaling for silence. The diplomat crouched beside her, trying to steady his breathing as he strained to hear what had caught her attention. Through the trees, he could see the faint, flickering lights of a search party. They were closer than he'd thought, their dark silhouettes moving methodically through the forest. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized they were heading straight for their position. "We can't stay here," he whispered. The princess nodded, her eyes scanning their surroundings. "Follow me, but stay low." They moved silently, weaving through the underbrush and using the thick foliage for cover. The diplomat marveled at how effortlessly she moved, her every step deliberate and soundless. He, on the other hand, felt clumsy and loud, every snapped twig underfoot a potential beacon for their enemies. They emerged into a small clearing where a large ancient structure loomed ahead. It was half buried in the earth, its smooth, metallic walls covered in vines and moss. The princess approached it quickly, her fingers tracing a series of faint, glowing symbols on the surface. The diplomat watched in awe as a hidden panel slid open, revealing a dark passageway. "Inside," she said, motioning for him to go first. He hesitated. "What about you?" "I'll seal it behind us," she assured him. "Now go." Reluctantly, he stepped into the passageway, the air inside cool and damp. The princess followed moments later, the panel sliding shut behind her with a soft hiss. Darkness enveloped them, broken only by the faint glow of the symbols on the walls. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice echoing softly. "An old resistance bunker," she said. "It hasn't been used in decades, but it's still secure." As they moved deeper into the bunker, the distant sounds of the search party faded. The diplomat felt a small measure of relief, though his nerves remained on edge. The princess led him to a small chamber, where she activated a console embedded in the wall. A soft light filled the room, revealing a simple but functional space. "We'll be safe here for now," she said, sinking onto a low bench. She looked exhausted, her usually graceful movements now sluggish. The diplomat sat across from her, his mind racing. "What happens now? We can't stay here forever." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I know, but we've bought ourselves some time. My people have sympathizers in the outer districts. If we can contact them, they'll help us." He studied her, noting the weight of the burden she carried. Despite everything she had endured, she remained resolute, her strength unshaken. He found himself in awe of her once again. "You've risked so much," he said softly. "Why?" Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the walls she had built around herself seemed to crumble. "Because I believe in something better," she said. "For my people, for yours, and for us." The last words hung in the air, unspoken but understood. The diplomat felt a warmth rise in his chest, a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel until now. It wasn't just her cause that had drawn him in. It was her. Before he could respond, the faint hum of a comm device crackled to life. The princess retrieved a small communicator from her belt, her expression tense. She exchanged a few words in her native language, her tone urgent but controlled. When she ended the transmission, she turned to him. "They're coming," she said. "The sympathizers. They'll extract us in a few hours, but we have to hold this position until then." He nodded, determination hardening his resolve. "Then we hold." The hours that followed were a test of patience and nerves. The sound of distant drones occasionally broke the silence, a grim reminder of the danger still lurking outside. But the diplomat and the princess stood side by side, ready for whatever came next. When the extraction team finally arrived, it was swift and precise. The princess's allies were a mix of species, their loyalty evident in the way they greeted her. The diplomat felt a pang of relief as they prepared to leave the bunker, though he knew their journey was far from over. As the transport lifted off, carrying them away from the forest and into the safety of the outer districts, the diplomat looked at the princess. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, her expression a mixture of hope and determination. "You've started something big," he said, his voice quiet. She turned to him, a faint smile playing on her lips. "We've started something big." For the first time in a long while, the diplomat felt a sense of purpose, a belief that, together, they could change the future. And as the stars stretched out before them, he knew that their fight was only just beginning.